You know when someone starts acting all suspicious out of nowhere? That's exactly what happened with Drew. We'd been together 4 months, and suddenly he's questioning every text, every friend, every plan I made. It was honestly insulting. I'm 21, not some kid who needs permission to have conversations. But let me tell you what really went down, because everyone's acting like I'm some master manipulator, when really I was just trying to figure out what I wanted. I'm Sophia, and I work one of those jobs where you deal with entitled customers all day while standing on concrete floors. Drew works at a warehouse, loading trucks and complaining about his back. We met through friends at some random house party. He seemed sweet enough, not the most exciting guy, but reliable. The kind of person who shows up when he says he will and remembers to text you back. Safe, you know? But here's what bothered me about Drew from pretty early on. He was weirdly trusting. Like, suspiciously trusting. He'd hand me his phone to take pictures, never even glanced at my screen when I was texting. Most guys I dated had at least some curiosity about who their girlfriend was talking to, but Drew seemed completely unbothered. I started wondering if he just didn't care enough to be curious, or if this was some reverse psychology thing. So I started checking his phone. Not because I'm paranoid, but because someone needed to be realistic about boundaries in this relationship. His messages were boring as hell. Work group chats, his buddies sending stupid memes, his mom asking about his eating habits. It was almost disappointing how clean his digital life was. But I kept looking because that's what you do when you care about protecting what you have. The weird part was that he never asked to see mine. Ever. I could be texting right in front of him and he'd just smile, like he was happy I had people to talk to. It felt wrong somehow. What kind of boyfriend doesn't wonder who his girlfriend spends her time talking to? Either he didn't care enough to be curious, or he was playing some game I couldn't figure out. That's when I decided we needed actual boundaries. Why should a guy in a serious relationship follow random girls from high school on social media? Why keep female coworkers texting about weekend plans? I suggested he clean up his online presence, be more selective about who had access to him. And he did it without arguing, which made me respect him more, but also wonder why he didn't have opinions about any of this stuff. Around that same time, my cousin Mia started hanging out with this new group. There was this guy Kevin, who was part of their circle. Not family, but you know how friend groups work. Everyone becomes connected after a while. Kevin was different from Drew in every way that mattered. He had actual opinions about things, asked what I thought instead of just nodding along with whatever I said. When I started joining Mia's group more often, I didn't mention Kevin specifically to Drew. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I wanted to see if he'd even notice I was spending time around other guys. Would he care enough to ask questions, or was he really as indifferent as he seemed? Honestly, he failed that test completely. Never asked who I was with, never seemed bothered that I was going out more. It was like he didn't register that anything had changed. So when Kevin started texting me outside group hangouts, I didn't see the problem. We'd talk about music, books, plans for the future. Real conversations, not just how was work and what's for dinner. Kevin actually listened when I talked about wanting more than retail forever, about maybe going back to school. Drew's response to that kind of talk was usually, "Sounds good, babe," before changing the subject to whatever game he was playing. I started looking forward to Kevin's messages more than Drew's calls. Kevin would send songs he thought I'd like, articles about places he wanted to visit. Drew's texts were mostly leaving work and pick up groceries. The difference was pretty obvious. But I told myself it was just friendship. Nothing wrong with having actual conversations with someone who engaged with my thoughts. The group hangouts became the best part of my week. Kevin and I would end up talking long after everyone else left, about everything and nothing. There was tension building that we both felt but weren't talking about. Meanwhile, Drew never asked why I was getting home later, never seemed to notice I was happier after those nights. He'd grunt hello from the couch and keep watching whatever show he was binge-watching. That's when I started testing him. I'd mention Kevin by name, see if Drew would react. Nothing. I'd talk about how smart Kevin was, how he'd recommended some book. Still nothing. I even mentioned Kevin paying for my coffee when I forgot my wallet. Drew just nodded and asked if I wanted pizza. It was like living with a roommate who occasionally wanted sex. When Kevin finally told me he had feelings for me, it felt like someone turned on a light in a dark room. Someone actually wanted me. Not just wanted me around, but wanted my thoughts, my time, my attention. After months of feeling invisible in my own relationship, being truly seen was intoxicating. I didn't say yes immediately, but I didn't say no either. We both knew something was going to happen. It was just a matter of when. That's when Drew finally started paying attention, but it was too little, too late. Suddenly he was asking questions about where I was going and who I'd be with. After months of not caring, now he wanted details. It felt manipulative, like he'd been keeping track of how little he could get away with caring, and now that he sensed competition, he wanted to reel me back in. "Who's Kevin?" he asked one night when the name came up. I'd been mentioning Kevin for weeks, and now suddenly Drew was curious. "Just a friend of Mia's," I said, which was true. But Drew kept pushing, asking how long I'd known him, what we talked about, why I'd never mentioned him before. That last question really pissed me off. I had mentioned Kevin before. Multiple times. Drew just hadn't been listening. Now he was acting like I'd been deliberately hiding something when really he'd been tuned out of my life for months. It felt unfair for him to suddenly start caring when it was convenient for him. The more questions he asked, the more defensive I got. What right did he have to interrogate me now? Where was this energy when I was trying to share my day with him? Where was this interest when I was practically begging him to engage with my life? Now that he sensed another guy might want me, suddenly I was worth paying attention to? When he asked to see my phone, I almost laughed. This guy who never once looked at my messages, who let me go through his whenever I wanted, now wanted to check my texts? The hypocrisy was unreal. I told him he was being insecure and paranoid, because that's exactly what it was. Classic behavior from someone who'd taken me for granted for months. But Drew kept pushing. He had this wounded expression whenever I mentioned going out, like I was personally attacking him by having friends. He started making passive-aggressive comments about how some girlfriends actually prioritize their relationships. It was pathetic. Where was this possessive energy when I actually wanted him to show some investment? I found myself getting angrier instead of feeling guilty. Drew's sudden neediness felt fake, like he was only interested now that someone else might be. He'd had months to show me I mattered, and he'd chosen to coast. Now he wanted to act like the devoted boyfriend? Please. When he started questioning everything I'd told him about Kevin, I was done. Suddenly my cousin's friend was suspicious. Suddenly hanging out with mixed groups was inappropriate. He'd never cared before when I had guy friends, but now every interaction was under a microscope. He was looking for reasons to be suspicious instead of trying to understand what was actually happening. So when Kevin asked me to meet him alone, I said yes, partly to spite Drew. If Drew wanted to act like I was already cheating, then maybe I should stop trying so hard to prove my innocence. He clearly thought the worst of me, no matter what I did. That coffee date turned into a long walk, then dinner, then back to Kevin's place to talk privately. And yeah, we did more than talk. But in my mind, Drew had already checked out months ago. He'd made it clear I wasn't a priority, so why should he be mine? The sex with Kevin was different. More intense, more connected. Like he was actually present instead of going through motions. Afterward, I felt more satisfied than I had in months with Drew. Not just physically, but emotionally. Kevin held me and asked what I was thinking. Drew usually rolled over and went to sleep. I started seeing Kevin regularly after that, always when Drew was working or busy with his own stuff, which was most of the time anyway. It wasn't like I was stealing time from our relationship. Drew barely noticed when I was around. If anything, I was happier when I came home from Kevin's, which made things with Drew easier. The hardest part was keeping track of two different lives. I had to remember what I'd told Drew about where I was going. Make sure my stories lined up. Hide certain texts, delete others, act normal when I was falling for someone else. The worst part was that Drew still didn't notice anything was different. Even when I was literally living a double life, he was oblivious. Everything fell apart when Drew decided to become a detective. Suddenly, Mr. Never Asks Questions wanted to know every detail about my day, my friends, my plans. It felt deliberately manipulative. Like he'd been testing me all along and now was ready to spring his trap. He confronted me about Kevin not actually being my cousin, which felt like such a stupid thing to focus on. When did I ever say Kevin was my blood relative? I said he was part of Mia's group, basically family. Sometimes you simplify relationships for people who don't know your social circle. It's not lying, it's practical. But Drew acted like I'd committed massive fraud. He had this gotcha expression like he'd uncovered some conspiracy. I tried explaining that Kevin was family through Mia. More complicated than friend, but not as simple as cousin. But Drew was already in full dramatic mode. He didn't want explanations, he wanted to be right about me being sneaky. Then he demanded to see my hidden photos, which was honestly the final straw. What kind of controlling boyfriend demands access to your private pictures? I had photos from before we were dating, personal stuff with friends, things that weren't his business. But he was acting like I was hiding evidence of murder. When he saw the photo booth pictures of me and Kevin, he completely lost it. They were innocent. We were with the whole group, just being goofy. But Drew acted like he'd caught us naked. He started screaming about lies and betrayal, using these dramatic words like I'd destroyed his entire world. What really bothered me was how quickly he was ready to throw away everything over some misunderstanding. 4 months together, and he'd end it all because I didn't provide a complete biography of everyone I knew? It showed me he'd never really trusted me. All that laid-back behavior was just an act. The fight got ugly fast. Drew was yelling about how I'd played him, how I'd been lying from the beginning. I was trying to explain that friends take pictures together, that group hangouts aren't cheating, that he was completely overreacting. But he was too worked up to hear logic. That's when I said it. I called him insecure, because that's exactly what he was being. After months of not caring about anything I did, suddenly he's paranoid about every interaction. After never showing jealousy, now he's acting like he owns me. It was insecure behavior, plain and simple. But calling him insecure made him angrier. He started ranting about how I'd manipulated him, how I'd taken advantage of his trust. Like trusting your girlfriend is some favor you're doing her. Like being a decent, non-controlling boyfriend means you deserve a medal. I told him if he couldn't handle me having male friends, maybe we weren't compatible. If he needed a girlfriend who asked permission before talking to other people, he should find someone else. Because I wasn't apologizing for having a social life or being friendly with people, he suddenly decided we're threats. That's when he walked out. Just left without trying to work anything out, or listen to my side. So typical. Avoid conflict until it explodes, then run instead of dealing with it like an adult. I was actually relieved when he left. Finally, I could stop pretending everything was fine. After that fight, I was done trying to convince Drew he was overreacting. If he wanted to throw away our relationship because he couldn't handle me having male friends, that was his choice. When Kevin texted asking if I wanted to talk about the drama, I said yes without hesitation. We met downtown, and Kevin was so understanding. He didn't bash Drew or push me to make decisions. He just listened while I vented about how unfair everything was. How Drew had ignored me for months, then suddenly wanted to control who I spent time with. Kevin pointed out things I hadn't fully realized. How Drew had taken me for granted, treated our relationship like it was guaranteed, instead of something worth investing in. Kevin said he'd noticed how dismissive Drew was when I'd tried to include him in conversations. How uninterested he seemed in things that mattered to me. Talking to Kevin made me realize how much I'd been settling. Here was someone who actually wanted to know my thoughts and feelings. Who didn't make me feel guilty for having opinions. Someone who saw potential in me, instead of just accepting whatever I was willing to offer. When Kevin suggested we continue talking somewhere private, I didn't hesitate. At his place, we talked for hours about everything. Families, dreams, what we wanted from life. Kevin had real plans beyond just showing up to work and watching TV. He wanted to travel, start his own business, actually do something meaningful. When I shared my goals, he asked questions, made suggestions, treated my dreams like they were valid. The physical connection felt inevitable. After all that emotional intimacy, after feeling truly understood for the first time in months, sleeping with Kevin felt right. Not like cheating, but like being honest about what I wanted. Drew had already ended things in my mind with his accusations and inability to trust me. The next few weeks were the happiest I'd been in forever. Kevin and I were together constantly. He'd pick me up after work, we'd spend entire weekends together, he'd surprise me with thoughtful things that showed he was paying attention. Not expensive gifts, just meaningful ones. Books by authors I'd mentioned, coffee from places I wanted to try, concert tickets for bands I'd been listening to. Drew had been completely silent since our fight. Not a single text or call. It was like he'd written me off entirely, which just confirmed I'd made the right choice. If he could walk away that easily, our relationship hadn't meant much to him anyway. I started picturing a real future with Kevin. He talked about moving somewhere bigger, starting fresh in a new city. He had savings, ambition, actual plans that extended beyond the next paycheck. For the first time in months, I felt excited about the future instead of just resigned to whatever happened. Everything imploded when Drew somehow got Kevin's number and called him directly. I still don't know how. Maybe through Mia, maybe through social media detective work. But apparently Drew was more resourceful than I'd thought. And Kevin, being honest, told Drew everything. Not to hurt me, but because he thought people deserved truth. Kevin explained the whole timeline. When we'd started talking, when it became more than friendship, when we first slept together. He even shared details I thought were private, like how I'd complained about feeling unappreciated, how I'd said Drew seemed checked out and uninterested. When Drew called me after talking to Kevin, his voice was completely different. Not angry or hurt, just cold and factual. He said he knew about everything now, knew exactly how long Kevin and I had been involved, knew I'd been lying about more than just who Kevin was. The worst part was how calm he sounded, like he'd expected this all along. He didn't yell or call me names. He just said, "We're done, Sophia. Don't contact me again," and hung up. That hurt worse than any screaming match would have. It was like I didn't matter enough to fight with anymore. Like he'd already grieved our relationship and moved on, while I was still trying to justify my choices. But the real betrayal came from Kevin. After Drew's call, Kevin started acting weird. Distant, guilty, like he regretted telling Drew the truth. When I asked about it, he said the conversation had made him realize how messy the situation was, how he didn't want to be involved in relationship drama. Apparently, Drew had been really cool about everything. Professional, even. He'd thanked Kevin for being honest and said he respected him for telling the truth. They'd had some man-to-man conversation where Kevin admitted he'd known about Drew the whole time but pursued me anyway. Drew didn't get angry. He just said he appreciated the honesty and wished Kevin luck. That's when Kevin started pulling away. Suddenly, he was too busy to hang out, took forever to respond to texts, seemed uncomfortable when I brought up future plans. He started saying things like, "Maybe we moved too fast," and "this whole situation is complicated." The exact opposite of how he'd been talking just days before. The worst part was realizing Kevin had probably been more impressed by Drew's mature response than by anything I'd done. Here I was, the girl who'd been juggling 2 relationships and lying to both, and Kevin was gaining respect for the guy I'd cheated on. It was humiliating. Within 2 weeks, Kevin had essentially ghosted me. He wouldn't return calls, gave one-word responses to texts, made excuses every time I suggested meeting up. It became obvious that whatever he'd felt for me wasn't strong enough to survive a little complexity. The moment things got messy, he bailed. So there I was, dumped by both the boyfriend I'd cheated on and the guy I'd cheated with. Drew had moved on with dignity, while I was left looking like exactly what I was. Someone who'd destroyed a good relationship for someone who didn't even want me long-term. The friend group dynamic became unbearable. Mia started acting weird around me, like she was judging my choices. Other people seemed to know what had happened, and there was uncomfortable tension whenever I showed up. Eventually, I just stopped going. It was easier than dealing with everyone's silent judgment. Drew, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. I'd see him around town sometimes, and he looked lighter somehow, like he'd lost weight he didn't know he was carrying. He'd nod politely if we made eye contact, but never tried to talk. It was like I'd become a stranger, someone from his past he remembered, but had no interest in revisiting. The hardest part was accepting that I'd thrown away something real for something that turned out to be nothing. Drew might have been boring, but he'd been consistent, loyal. He'd trusted me completely, and I'd used that trust to betray him in the worst way. Kevin had been exciting, but the moment our relationship required actual commitment, he vanished. Now I'm 21 and starting over, wondering if I'll ever find someone who combines Drew's loyalty with Kevin's excitement. Wondering if I even deserve that after what I did. But mostly just trying to figure out how I convinced myself that lying and cheating was justified because my boyfriend didn't pay enough attention to me. Looking back, I can see Drew probably sensed something was off long before he said anything. Maybe his sudden questions weren't paranoia. Maybe they were him trying to save our relationship when he felt me pulling away. Maybe if I'd been honest about feeling disconnected instead of seeking connection elsewhere, we could have worked things out. But I'll never know now. And honestly, maybe that's exactly what I deserve.